Have you ever stood up for someone when you knew it could cost you everything? Sometimes the most dangerous moments reveal who we truly are. I'm curious, where are you watching from tonight? And have you ever found yourself protecting someone vulnerable when the stakes were impossibly high? The water glass shattered against the marble floor like her hopes for keeping this job. Celeste Romano watched the crystal fragments scatter across the pristine dining room of Bellacourt, knowing her manager Franco would make her pay for every single piece from her already meager paycheck. But it wasn't the broken glass that made her stomach clench with dread. It was the way the little girl at table 12 had flinched when the crash echoed through the restaurant, her dark eyes wide with terror that no 80-year-old should ever know. 22 and already exhausted by life, Celeste had been working double shifts at the upscale Italian restaurant for 3 months, desperately trying to save enough money to help her younger brother Marcus finish his sophomore year at State. Every tip mattered. Every shift counted. Every mistake could mean the difference between Marcus staying in school or dropping out to work construction like their father had before the accident took both their parents 5 years ago. She smoothed her black server's apron and approached the girl's table with a fresh water glass, forcing her warmest smile despite the throbbing headache that had been building since her morning shift at the diner ended at noon. The child sat alone except for an older woman who seemed more interested in her phone than her young charge, dressed in an expensive navy dress that probably cost more than Celeste made in a week. The little girl looked up as Celeste approached, and something in those intelligent dark eyes reminded her painfully of Marcus at that age, all wide-eyed curiosity barely masking a deep sadness that children shouldn't have to carry. The girl's olive skin was pale, her small hands folded carefully in her lap as if she'd been taught not to touch anything unnecessarily. "I'm sorry about the noise, sweetheart," Celeste said softly, setting down the new water glass with extra care. "Sometimes these old glasses just decide they don't want to work anymore." The girl's lips curved in a tiny smile. "My name is Lucia. What's yours?" "I'm Celeste. Are you enjoying your dinner, Lucia?" Before the child could answer, Franco appeared beside their table like a storm cloud, his face flushed red with the anger that seemed to perpetually simmer just beneath his perfectly pressed suit. At 45, he ran Bellacourt with the iron fist of someone who'd never quite made it to owner but wielded his manager title like a weapon against anyone he considered beneath him. "You," he snapped at Celeste, his voice carrying across the elegant dining room and drawing stares from other patrons. "Clean up that mess immediately. And you," he turned his furious attention to Lucia, causing the child to shrink back in her chair. "Stop playing with the water. This isn't a playground. Children who can't behave properly shouldn't be brought to establishments like this." Celeste felt her protective instincts flare to life, the same fierce defensiveness that had driven her to work 3 jobs rather than let Marcus go hungry. The little girl hadn't been playing, hadn't done anything wrong except exist in Franco's presence, and the way Lucia's face crumpled at his harsh words sent a surge of righteous anger through Celeste's chest. "She was just being careful with her glass," Celeste said, stepping slightly between Franco and the table. "There's no need to speak to her that way." Franco's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Excuse me? Did you just tell me how to manage my restaurant?" "I'm telling you there's no reason to frighten a child for no reason," Celeste replied, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "She's been perfectly well behaved." The older woman at the table finally looked up from her phone, alarm crossing her features as she registered the confrontation brewing around her young charge. "Lucia, perhaps we should go," she began nervously. But Franco wasn't finished. His face had progressed from red to purple, and Celeste could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he calculated how to assert his authority without causing too much of a scene. Unfortunately for both of them, Franco had never been particularly skilled at reading the room. "This is exactly the kind of insubordination I'd expect from someone like you," he hissed, loud enough that conversations at nearby tables stopped entirely. "You come in here from whatever trailer park you crawled out of and think you can tell me how to run my business? You're lucky I hired you at all with no experience and no references worth mentioning." The insult hit its mark, heat flooding Celeste's cheeks as every insecurity about her background, her clothes, her desperate financial situation crashed over her. She was acutely aware of the other diners watching now, their expensive jewelry glinting in the soft lighting as they witnessed her humiliation. But what kept her standing, what prevented her from shrinking away in shame, was the way Lucia had pressed herself back in her chair, dark eyes fixed on Celeste with something that looked like desperate hope. The child was waiting to see what would happen, waiting to see if someone would finally stand up to the angry man, or if she'd learn once again that powerful people could say whatever they wanted to those with less power and no one would stop them. "You're right, Franco," Celeste said quietly, her voice carrying in the sudden hush that had fallen over the dining room. "I don't have experience working in places like this. I've been too busy working 3 jobs to keep my family fed to worry about learning the proper etiquette for intimidating children. But I know enough to recognize a bully when I see one, and I know enough to recognize when someone needs protection." She turned to Lucia, whose eyes had gone wide with shock and something that might have been admiration. "You don't deserve to be spoken to that way, sweetheart. No one does, especially not someone as polite and kind as you've been tonight." Franco's face went from purple to white with rage. "You're fired. Get out of my restaurant. Now, don't expect a final paycheck, and don't expect any references. You'll never work in food service in this city again if I have anything to say about it." The threat hit like a physical blow. Celeste felt her knees wobble as the full implications crashed over her. Without this job, without the tips that barely covered her portion of the rent, she'd have to pull Marcus out of school within a month. Everything she'd worked for, sacrificed for, planned for, crumbling because she couldn't stand by and watch a grown man terrorize a little girl. But she found she couldn't regret it. Looking down at Lucia's small face, seeing something like hope kindling in those dark eyes, Celeste discovered she'd make the same choice again without hesitation. That's when the voice cut through the tension like silk over steel, quiet but carrying such unmistakable authority that every conversation in the restaurant stopped entirely. "Is there a problem here?" Celeste turned along with everyone else to see a man approaching from the direction of the private booths that lined the back wall. He was tall, probably 6 foot woe, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit was clearly custom-tailored, and his green-gray eyes swept the scene with the calculating assessment of someone accustomed to reading situations quickly and accurately. But it was the way he moved that made Celeste's breath catch in her throat. There was a predatory grace to his steps, the controlled power of someone who could be gentle when gentleness was called for and deadly when it wasn't. Everything about him whispered dangerous, from the expensive watch on his wrist to the way the other restaurant staff suddenly found urgent tasks that required their immediate attention elsewhere. "Mr. Torino," Franco stammered, his aggressive posture deflating instantly. "I was just handling a disciplinary issue with one of the staff. Nothing for you to concern yourself with." "Torino." Celeste felt recognition click into place. She'd heard whispers about the man who owned half the Italian restaurants in the city, whose business interests seemed to extend far beyond the food service industry, whose very name made people speak in careful, respectful tones. She'd never seen him before, but she'd heard enough to know that Dante Torino was not a man to be trifled with. He looked at Franco with the kind of mild interest that somehow felt more threatening than rage. "I see. And this disciplinary issue involved my daughter how exactly?" Celeste's gaze snapped back to Lucia, pieces falling into place with startling clarity. The expensive dress, the nervous nanny, the careful way the child had been taught to behave in public. No wonder she'd seemed so familiar with the restaurant's atmosphere. Dante Torino's daughter had just witnessed her father's manager verbally assault a waitress for defending her, and from the way his jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, he'd heard every word. "Your daughter was being disruptive," Franco tried, but his voice lacked conviction now. "I was simply maintaining the standard of service our patrons expect." Dante's attention shifted to Celeste for the first time, and she felt the full impact of those green-gray eyes like a physical force. There was intelligence there, and something that might have been approval, but also a barely leashed power that made her acutely aware of how out of her depth she was in this world of expensive suits and unspoken threats. "Miss Romano, isn't it?" he said, and she wondered how he knew her name until she remembered the small nameplate on her apron. "Would you mind telling me exactly what happened here?" The smart thing would have been to minimize the situation, to downplay Franco's behavior, and hope to salvage what remained of her employment prospects. But looking into Dante Torino's eyes, Celeste found herself incapable of anything less than complete honesty. "I dropped a water glass by accident," she said simply. "Your daughter was sitting quietly at her table." Mr. Franco became angry about the noise and spoke harshly to Lucia, calling her disruptive and saying children who can't behave shouldn't be brought to places like this. I told him there was no need to speak to her that way because she hadn't done anything wrong. He didn't appreciate the feedback. And then what happened? He told me I was insubordinate and fired me for standing up to him. He also said I'd never work in food service again in this city. Dante nodded slowly, as if her words confirmed something he'd already suspected. Then he looked down at his daughter, and Celeste watched his entire demeanor shift from controlled menace to gentle concern. "Lucia, Principessa, are you all right?" The little girl nodded solemnly. "Celeste was nice to me, Papa. She stood up for me when the angry man was being mean." Something dangerous flickered in Dante's expression before he smoothed it away. "I see. Franco, you're fired. Security will escort you out. Don't expect references, and if I hear you found employment at any establishment I have dealings with, which includes most restaurants in this city, you'll find yourself looking for work in a different profession entirely." Franco's mouth fell open in shock. "Sir, you can't be serious. Over some waitress who doesn't know her place? I'm serious about protecting my daughter from men who think their authority gives them the right to intimidate children." Dante replied calmly. "I'm serious about employing people who have the courage to do what's right even when it costs them. And I'm serious about making sure you understand that your services are no longer required here or anywhere else I have influence." He turned back to Celeste, and she found herself trapped in that steady gaze again. "Miss Romano, I'm offering you Franco's position as general manager. The salary is 60,000 plus benefits and profit sharing. You'll oversee all front-of-house operations and report directly to me. Are you interested?" Celeste felt the world tilt on its axis. An hour ago she'd been scrambling to make rent. Now she was being offered more money than she'd ever imagined making, by a man whose reputation preceded him like storm clouds, in front of his daughter who was looking at her with undisguised hope. "I don't have management experience," she managed. "But you have something more valuable," Dante said quietly. "You have the courage to protect those who can't protect themselves, and the integrity to do what's right regardless of the personal cost. Everything else can be learned." Looking down at Lucia's expectant face, then back into Dante Torino's intense eyes, Celeste realized she was standing at a crossroads that would change everything. She could accept his offer and step into a world she didn't understand, working for a man whose very presence made her pulse quicken with something that wasn't quite fear. Or she could walk away and return to her 3 jobs and constant financial stress, knowing she'd turned down the opportunity of a lifetime because she was too afraid to take the risk. "Yes," she heard herself say. "I'm very interested." 3 days later, Celeste still felt like she was living someone else's life. She stood in the office that had been Franco's, looking at the mahogany desk and leather chairs that now supposedly belonged to her, wondering if she was experiencing an elaborate dream that would end with her alarm clock dragging her back to reality and her 3-job existence. The promotion had happened so quickly she barely remembered signing the paperwork. Dante had handled everything with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making life-changing decisions in minutes rather than months. New bank account, direct deposit, benefits package that included health insurance better than anything she'd ever imagined having access to. He'd even arranged for uniforms in her size to be delivered overnight, replacing her worn server's apron with elegant black dresses that made her feel like she belonged in the restaurant's sophisticated atmosphere. But it was the salary that still made her hands shake when she thought about it. $60,000. More than double what she'd been making across all 3 jobs combined. Enough to not only keep Marcus in school but to move them both out of the cramped studio apartment they shared and maybe, impossibly, start building something resembling financial security. She'd called Marcus that first night, trying to explain what had happened without revealing the full complicated truth about exactly who Dante Torino was, or why his mere presence made every staff member at Bellacourt speak in hushed, respectful tones. Her brother had been thrilled about her promotion, though she could hear the underlying worry in his voice when he asked if she was sure this wasn't too good to be true. That same question had been haunting her for 3 days. Men like Dante Torino didn't hand out $60,000 jobs to waitresses they'd known for 5 minutes, no matter how principled their defense of his daughter had been. There had to be more to it, some angle she wasn't seeing, some expectation that hadn't been made clear yet. The restaurant's morning prep was in full swing around her when she heard the familiar sound of small feet against marble. Celeste looked up from the inventory sheets she'd been reviewing to see Lucia approaching her office, dressed in a pristine school uniform and carrying a backpack that probably cost more than Celeste's rent used to be. "Good morning, sweetheart," Celeste said, rising from her desk with a genuine smile. The child's presence had become the brightest part of her days since accepting the position. "Don't you have school today?" "We're going after breakfast," Lucia replied solemnly. "But I wanted to ask if you could be my server today. Mrs. Chun," she gestured toward the older woman hovering nearby, "says I should let the regular staff handle it, but I like talking to you better." Mrs. Chun, whom Celeste had learned was Lucia's nanny and had been with the family for 2 years, stepped forward with an apologetic expression. "I told her you're much too important now to serve tables, Miss Romano, but she insisted on asking." The innocent request made Celeste's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. In her former life, being too important to serve tables would have been laughable. Now, she found herself genuinely touched that Lucia still wanted that personal connection despite the change in their circumstances. "I think I can make an exception for my favorite customer," Celeste said, glancing at her watch. "I have a few minutes before the morning meeting. Should we get you set up at your usual table?" Lucia's face lit up with the kind of pure joy that reminded Celeste exactly why she'd risked everything to defend this child. They walked together through the dining room, Lucia chattering about her upcoming math test and her art project while Celeste found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since accepting her new position. It wasn't until they'd reached table 12 that Celeste noticed the man in the corner booth, partially hidden behind a newspaper but clearly observing their interaction. Even from across the room, there was no mistaking Dante's presence. Something about the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself with that controlled alertness she was beginning to recognize as his default state. Her pulse quickened involuntarily as their eyes met briefly over his newspaper. There was something almost proprietary in his gaze as he watched her with his daughter, an intensity that made her acutely aware of how natural this felt, how easily she'd fallen into the role of someone Lucia could depend on. "Does your father always watch you have breakfast?" Celeste asked as she helped Lucia settle into her chair, trying to keep her tone casual despite the way her skin seemed to tingle under Dante's distant observation. "Papa likes to make sure I'm safe," Lucia said matter-of-factly. "He says there are people who might want to hurt me because of who he is, so he has to be careful. But I think he also just likes watching people he cares about." The simple statement hit Celeste like a gentle punch to the chest. People he cares about. Did that include her now? Was that why he'd offered her this position, why he seemed to materialize whenever she was working with Lucia? Or was she reading too much into what was simply a protective father ensuring his daughter's safety? "What would you like for breakfast today, Principessa?" Celeste asked, borrowing the endearment she'd heard Dante use. Lucia giggled at the Italian word. "You sound almost as good as Papa when you say that. Can I have the chocolate chip pancakes? An orange juice, but not too much pulp because it feels weird in my mouth." As Celeste took the order and headed toward the kitchen, she could feel Dante's attention following her movements. There was something both thrilling and unnerving about being the focus of such intense awareness. She'd never been the kind of woman who attracted powerful men's attention, had never even wanted to be, but there was no denying the electric current that seemed to run between them whenever they were in the same space. The morning meeting with the front of house staff went smoothly, though Celeste could sense the subtle dynamics still adjusting to her sudden elevation from their peer to their supervisor. She made notes about scheduling adjustments and discussed upcoming reservations, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel, while part of her mind remained focused on the man reading his newspaper in the corner booth. When she returned to check on Lucia's breakfast, she found Dante had moved to his daughter's table, his newspaper folded neatly beside his untouched espresso. Up close, in the morning light streaming through the restaurant's windows. He was even more striking than she remembered. The charcoal suit had been replaced by dark jeans and a navy sweater that somehow made him look both more approachable and more dangerous. "Miss Romano," he said as she approached, and she wondered if she'd ever get used to the way her name sounded in his voice, like silk over steel. "I hope you're settling in well to your new responsibilities." "Everyone's been very helpful," she replied, setting down Lucia's orange juice with hands that she hoped weren't visibly shaking. "I'm still learning, but I think I'm getting the hang of it." "Learning is a process," he said, those green-gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her wonder what exactly he was looking for. "I have confidence in your abilities, or I wouldn't have offered you the position." There was something in his tone that suggested layers of meaning beneath the surface, implications she wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. Instead, she focused on Lucia, who was demolishing her chocolate chip pancakes with the single-minded determination that only 80-year-olds could bring to their favorite breakfast foods. "How are the pancakes, sweetheart?" "Perfect," Lucia announced around a mouthful of syrup and chocolate chips. "Papa, did you know Celeste has a brother in college? She's working really hard to help him stay in school." Dante's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been approval flickering across his features. "That's admirable. Education is important for creating opportunities." He was looking at her again with that assessing gaze, and Celeste had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing far more than she intended to reveal. Something about him made her want to confess things she'd never told anyone, to lay out all her fears and hopes and desperate dreams for someone who might actually have the power to make them reality. It was a dangerous impulse, and she forced herself to step back both physically and emotionally. "Your father is right," she told Lucia. "Education opens doors that stay closed otherwise." "What did you study?" Dante asked, and the question seemed genuinely curious rather than merely polite. "I didn't finish college," Celeste admitted, the familiar shame burning in her chest. "I had to drop out after my parents died to take care of Marcus and start working. But maybe someday I'll go back." There was no judgment in Dante's expression, only thoughtful consideration. "What were you studying?" "Business administration," she said, then felt compelled to add, "I know it's ironic, considering I ended up managing a restaurant without any actual management training." "Sometimes experience teaches more than textbooks," Dante replied quietly. "And sometimes life forces us to develop skills we didn't know we had." There was something in his voice that suggested personal experience with unexpected responsibilities, with having to grow up faster than planned. It made her wonder what circumstances had shaped him into the man he was, what losses or challenges had created that controlled intensity she found so compelling and frightening. "Papa had to take over his family's business when he was only 23, Lucia said helpfully, apparently unaware that she was sharing sensitive information. "Grandpa got sick and Papa had to learn everything really fast." Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he didn't correct his daughter or change the subject. Instead, he looked at Celeste with something that might have been understanding. "We all do what we have to do to protect the people we love," he said simply. The statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Celeste's pulse quicken. Was he talking about taking over his family business or something larger? Was he explaining why he'd offered her this position, why he seemed to be drawing her into his world despite the obvious complications? Before she could formulate a response, her phone buzzed with a text from her friend Maya, who worked the morning shift at the diner where Celeste used to clock in at 5 a.m. "Maya, girl, you need to call me. There are rumors going around about your new job and your boss. Some seriously concerning rumors." Celeste's stomach dropped as she read the message, suddenly acutely aware that she was standing in public, having what felt like an increasingly intimate conversation with a man whose reputation apparently preceded him in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Excuse me," she said to Dante and Lucia. "I just need to handle something quickly." She stepped away from the table, moving toward the relative privacy of the service station, but not before catching the sharp look Dante gave her phone. There was nothing threatening in his expression, but there was definitely awareness, as if he'd somehow sensed the shift in her mood and was already calculating the potential sources of her sudden tension. Maya answered on the first ring. "Celeste, thank God. Are you somewhere you can talk freely? Not really, Celeste replied, glancing back toward table 12, where Dante appeared to be engaged in animated conversation with his daughter about her upcoming art project. What kind of rumors? The kind that suggest your new boss isn't just in the restaurant business, if you know what I mean. And the kind that say women who get too close to him have a tendency to disappear from their old lives entirely. Maya's words sent ice through Celeste's veins, even as part of her mind protested that the woman was being dramatic. People didn't just disappear in real life, not over restaurant jobs, and certainly not because they defended someone's daughter from an abusive manager. But looking back at Dante, noting the way other diners gave his table a respectful wide berth despite the restaurant being busy, the way the staff moved with extra efficiency whenever he was present, she had to admit that Maya's concerns weren't entirely unfounded. "I'll call you later," she told her friend. "I need to get back to work." When she returned to table 12, Dante was alone, his daughter apparently having finished breakfast and left with Mrs. Chun for school. He looked up as she approached, and she had the unsettling feeling that he'd heard every word of her phone conversation despite the distance and ambient noise. "Everything all right?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Just checking in with a friend," Celeste replied, trying to match his casual tone while her mind raced with questions she wasn't sure she was ready to ask or have answered. Dante nodded slowly, his green-gray eyes studying her face with that intensity that made her feel simultaneously seen and exposed. "It's natural to have questions when your circumstances change dramatically," he said finally. "And it's natural for friends to be protective when they don't understand the full situation." The statement was carefully constructed, acknowledging her obvious concerns without directly addressing them, leaving room for her to ask for clarification while not forcing the conversation in a direction she might not be ready to handle. Celeste found herself caught between curiosity and caution, drawn to the quiet strength she sensed beneath his controlled exterior, while simultaneously aware that she was venturing into territory far beyond her previous experience. She was a waitress from a working-class neighborhood who'd never owned anything more expensive than a reliable car. He was a man who made decisions that changed lives and apparently owned enough of the city's dining establishments to end someone's career with a phone call. The smart thing would be to maintain professional distance, to accept her good fortune and not ask questions about the man who'd provided it. But looking into Dante's eyes, seeing something that might have been loneliness beneath the power and control, she found herself wanting to know more about the person behind the reputation. "I should let you get back to your day," she said finally, though she made no immediate move to leave. "I'm not going anywhere for a while," Dante replied, settling back in his chair with the patient alertness of someone accustomed to long waits. "I have some calls to make, and I find the atmosphere here conducive to business." There was an invitation in his words, subtle but unmistakable. He was giving her the opportunity to ask her questions, to seek the explanations that her friend's warnings had made urgent. Or she could retreat to the safety of her office and her inventory sheets, leaving the dangerous territory of getting to know Dante Torino unexplored. Celeste realized she was standing at another crossroads, smaller than the one that had led to this job but potentially just as significant. She could play it safe and maintain the boundaries between employer and employee, or she could acknowledge the connection that seemed to be building between them and see where it led. Looking at Dante's patient expression, she made her choice. "Would you mind if I joined you for a few minutes?" she asked. "I find myself curious about the man who changed my life in the space of 5 minutes." Dante's expression shifted almost imperceptibly when she asked to join him. Something that might have been surprise followed quickly by what looked like genuine pleasure. He gestured to the chair across from him with an elegant economy of movement that made even simple gestures seem deliberate and controlled. "Please," he said, and Celeste found herself settling into the leather chair with a nervous energy that had nothing to do with her new job responsibilities and everything to do with the way those green-gray eyes seemed to see straight through her carefully maintained composure. The restaurant hummed with quiet efficiency around them, early lunch preparations beginning in the kitchen while the dining room maintained the peaceful lull that came between breakfast and the afternoon rush. It struck Celeste as surreal that she was sitting across from Dante Torino like this, conducting what felt increasingly like a personal conversation rather than a business meeting. when 2 weeks ago her biggest concern had been whether she could afford to fix her car's transmission. "You wanted to know about the man who changed your life?" Dante said quietly, leaning back in his chair with that patient alertness she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "What specifically would you like to know?" His directness caught her off guard. She'd expected deflection, maybe charm or humor to sidestep serious questions. Instead, he was offering her exactly what she'd asked for with a frankness that made her realize she needed to be equally direct about what she was really seeking. "My friend thinks you're dangerous," Celeste said finally, watching his face for reaction. "She thinks women who get involved with you have a tendency to disappear from their old lives. She's worried that accepting this job was a mistake that I might not be able to undo." Dante was quiet for a long moment, his fingers moving absently against his espresso cup while he considered her words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that made her understand he was choosing his words very carefully. "Your friend is right that I'm dangerous," he said simply. "My business interests extend beyond restaurants into areas that most people would find concerning. I have enemies who would hurt anyone I care about simply to cause me pain. And yes, the women who choose to be part of my life do tend to leave their old lives behind, though not because they disappear. Because they choose something different." The honesty was both reassuring and terrifying. Part of Celeste had hoped he'd laugh off Maya's concerns, provide innocent explanations that would allow her to continue enjoying the financial security and growing attraction without having to grapple with darker implications. Instead, he was confirming her friend's warnings, while somehow making them sound like reasonable risks rather than insurmountable obstacles. "What kind of business interests?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The kind that require careful management and absolute loyalty," Dante replied, those intense eyes never leaving her face. "The kind that have been in my family for 3 generations and provide security and prosperity for dozens of families who depend on me to make the right decisions." He wasn't denying what she was thinking, wasn't trying to soften the reality with euphemisms or deflection. There was something almost refreshing about his refusal to lie to her, even as the implications of his words settled like lead in her stomach. "And Lucia? What happens to her if something goes wrong with these business interests?" Something flickered across Dante's features, pain so quick and deep that it was gone before she could fully identify it. "That's exactly the question I ask myself every day," he said quietly. "How to keep her safe in a world where my enemies would see her as the perfect way to destroy me." The raw honesty in his voice caught Celeste completely unprepared. This wasn't the controlled man who commanded respect with a look and made life-changing decisions with casual efficiency. This was a father carrying a burden that probably kept him awake at night, trying to balance protecting his daughter with giving her anything resembling a normal childhood. "Is that why you offered me this job?" she asked gently. "Because you saw that I'd protect her?" "Partially," Dante admitted, "but also because watching you risk everything to defend her showed me something about who you are at your core. And because Lucia hasn't smiled the way she smiles around you since her mother died." The mention of his wife hit Celeste like a punch to the chest. Not because she was jealous of a dead woman, but because of the grief that flickered across his features when he said the words. There was a story there, loss and pain, that probably explained the careful control he maintained over every aspect of his life. "What happened to her mother?" she asked softly. "Cancer," Dante said simply. "Diagnosed when Lucia was 5, gone by her 6th birthday. Isabella was the light in both our lives. And when she died, we both retreated into ourselves. Lucia because she was too young to understand why Mama wasn't coming home, and me because I didn't know how to be both parents to a grieving child while managing business interests that don't allow for weakness or distraction." Celeste felt tears prick at her eyes as she imagined 6-year-old Lucia trying to process such devastating loss, and Dante trying to hold his world together while his own heart was breaking. It explained so much about the careful way he watched his daughter, the protective instincts that seemed to govern every decision, the loneliness she sensed beneath his powerful exterior. "I'm sorry," she said, inadequate words that carried all the compassion she could manage. "That must have been impossibly difficult for both of you." "It was the darkest period of my life," Dante replied quietly. "But watching you with Lucia these past few days, seeing her laugh and trust someone new again, I'm reminded that healing is possible even when it seems impossible. There was something in his voice when he said those words, a warmth directed at her specifically that made Celeste's pulse quicken with dangerous awareness. The attraction that had been building between them since that first night was shifting into something deeper, something that acknowledged the person beneath the reputation and the power. I lost my parents when I was 17, she heard herself saying, surprising herself with the admission. Car accident on Christmas Eve. Marcus was 12, and suddenly I was responsible for keeping us together, keeping us fed, making sure he stayed in school while I figured out how to be an adult before I was ready. Understanding flickered in Dante's eyes, recognition of shared experience with unwanted responsibility and premature loss. You understand what it means to protect someone you love regardless of the cost, he said. It's different when it's your child though, Celeste replied. Marcus is my brother. I chose to take care of him, but Lucia needs you in a way that's completely dependent, completely trusting. That kind of love must be both beautiful and terrifying. It is, Dante said simply, and the quiet honesty in those two words made something shift in Celeste's chest. A recognition that she was falling for this man in a way that went far beyond physical attraction or grateful appreciation for the opportunities he'd provided. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them like a bridge across the space that had separated their very different worlds. Celeste found herself studying his hands where they rested on the table, noting the elegant fingers and the thin white scar across his knuckles that spoke of violence in his past, contradictions that somehow made perfect sense when she considered everything he'd revealed about his life and responsibilities. The quiet moment was shattered by her phone ringing with a number she recognized immediately. The school where Lucia was enrolled, calling in the middle of the day with the kind of urgency that made every parent's heart stop. Dante answered before the second ring, his entire demeanor shifting to razor-sharp alertness. Yes, Celeste couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she could see the tension that flooded Dante's expression as he listened. His free hand clenched into a fist on the table, and something dangerous flickered behind his controlled facade. I'm on my way, he said, ending the call and rising from his chair with predatory grace. Lucia had what they're calling a panic attack during recess. She's asking for you specifically. For me? Celeste's heart clenched at the thought of Lucia frightened and asking for comfort from someone who was still essentially a stranger. The school says she's refusing to talk to anyone else, Dante explained, already moving toward the exit with the kind of focused urgency that suggested he was accustomed to handling crises efficiently. They want a familiar adult to come get her, and apparently you qualify. Of course I'll come, Celeste said, grabbing her purse and following him toward the door. Whatever she needs. The drive to Lucia's private school passed in tense silence, Dante's hands gripping the steering wheel of his black BMW with controlled force, while Celeste tried not to think about what could have triggered a panic attack in an 80-year-old child who seemed so composed and well-adjusted most of the time. They found Lucia in the school nurse's office, curled in a chair that looked too big for her small frame, her school uniform rumpled and her dark eyes red-rimmed with tears. The moment she saw Celeste, she launched herself across the room and into her arms with the desperate trust that only children could demonstrate. I dreamed Mama died again, Lucia whispered against Celeste's neck. And then I woke up, but I was at school and I couldn't remember if you were real or if I dreamed you too. Celeste's heart broke completely as she held the trembling child, understanding flooding through her as she realized what had happened. Lucia had allowed herself to trust and care about someone new, and her subconscious had panicked at the possibility of losing another important person in her life. I'm real, sweetheart, Celeste murmured, stroking Lucia's hair while meeting Dante's eyes over his daughter's head. I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere. Over Lucia's head, she saw something shift in Dante's expression, an awareness that they'd crossed a line from professional courtesy into something much deeper and more complicated. His daughter was clinging to her with the desperate need of a child who'd learned too young that the people you love can vanish without warning, and Celeste was responding with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd already claimed this little girl as her own. The drive back to the restaurant was quieter, Lucia asleep in the back seat while Dante and Celeste spoke in low voices about scheduling changes, and the possibility of Lucia spending more time at the restaurant where she felt safe. Practical arrangements that felt intensely personal given the context. Decisions that acknowledged Celeste's evolving role in their lives without explicitly defining what that role would ultimately become. It was nearly evening when they finally returned to Bellecourt, the dinner rush beginning to build while Lucia helped Celeste review reservations from behind the hostess station. The routine of work was soothing after the emotional intensity of the afternoon. Normal tasks that allowed all three of them to settle back into the comfortable rhythm they'd been developing. That normalcy was shattered when two men in dark suits entered the restaurant just before 7 o'clock, moving with the kind of purposeful intent that immediately raised every alarm bell in Celeste's consciousness. They didn't wait to be seated, didn't pause to appreciate the elegant atmosphere or extensive wine list. Instead, they approached the hostess station with the focused attention of people who had specific business to conduct. "We're looking for information about Dante Torino," the taller one said, his voice carrying a faint accent that Celeste couldn't quite place. "We heard he might be found here." "I'm sorry, but Mr. Torino isn't available this evening," Celeste replied, every instinct screaming danger even as she maintained her professional composure. "Would you like me to make a reservation for another time?" The men exchanged a look that made Celeste's blood run cold. This wasn't a business meeting or social call. This was something else entirely. Something that made the fine hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "Perhaps you could tell him that the Marconi family is interested in discussing some recent changes in neighborhood business arrangements," the second man said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll be in touch about scheduling something more formal." They left as abruptly as they'd arrived, but not before the taller one's gaze lingered on Lucia with an attention that made Celeste's protective instincts flare to dangerous levels. She waited until they were completely gone before pulling out her phone to call Dante, who'd left an hour earlier to handle some business at another location. He answered on the first ring, and she could hear traffic in the background that suggested he was already on his way back. "Two men just came by asking about you," she said without preamble. "They mentioned the Marconi family and said something about recent changes in business arrangements." They looked at Lucia in a way that made me very uncomfortable. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Celeste wondered if the call had dropped. When Dante finally spoke, his voice carried a coldness she'd never heard before. "Take Lucia to my office and lock the door. Don't open it for anyone except me. I'll be there in 5 minutes." The 5 minutes that followed were some of the longest in Celeste's life. She sat with Lucia in Dante's private office, trying to maintain normal conversation about homework and weekend plans, while every sound from the restaurant made her pulse spike with anxiety. When she finally heard Dante's voice in the hallway, she felt relief flood through her with almost physical force. He entered his office with two other men she'd never seen before, both carrying themselves with the same controlled alertness that characterized Dante himself. He looked at Lucia first, checking for any signs of distress, before turning his attention to Celeste with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously protected and exposed. "Did they touch anything? Did they ask any other questions?" "No," Celeste replied. "They just wanted to know where to find you. And when I said you weren't available, they left that message about the Marconi family wanting to discuss business arrangements." One of the men with Dante stepped forward, his expression grim. "They're moving faster than we anticipated. The restaurant hits were meant to draw you out, make you predictable. Which means they know about both of you," Dante said quietly, his gaze moving between Celeste and Lucia with an expression that suggested he was calculating risks and making decisions at lightning speed. "And they're not interested in keeping this conflict contained to business anymore." Celeste felt ice flood her veins as the implications of his words sank in. Whatever was happening between Dante and these Marconi people, it had apparently escalated beyond professional disagreement into something that threatened anyone connected to him. Including her. Including Lucia. "What does that mean?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "It means your old life officially ended tonight," Dante replied, those green-gray eyes holding hers with complete honesty. "Because anyone who cares about me or who I care about is now a target, and there's no going back from that reality." Looking at Lucia, who was listening to this conversation with the solemn attention of a child, who'd learned too early that adult problems sometimes became children's problems. Celeste realized she'd already made her choice. She'd made it the moment she'd held this little girl while she cried. The moment she'd felt her heart break for Dante's grief and loneliness. The moment she'd recognized that walking away from them would hurt worse than facing whatever danger staying might bring. "Then I guess we'd better figure out how to handle these Marconi people," she said quietly. Dante's expression shifted, surprise followed by something that looked like admiration and relief. "You understand what you're saying? What you're choosing?" "I'm saying that some things are worth the risk," Celeste replied, reaching for Lucia's hand while meeting Dante's intense gaze. "And I'm choosing the people who are worth protecting over the safety that comes from running away." For the first time since she'd known him, Dante's careful control slipped completely. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides, cupping her face in his hands with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the dangerous energy radiating from him. "You're remarkable," he said quietly, and then he kissed her. The kiss was soft at first, almost tentative, as if he was asking permission even after everything they'd shared. But when Celeste responded, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders while she poured all her fear and hope and growing love into the connection between them, the kiss deepened into something that felt like a promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dante rested his forehead against hers with an expression of wonder and determination that made her feel like the most precious thing in his world. "I'll keep you safe," he promised, the words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Both of you, whatever it takes." Looking into his eyes, feeling Lucia's small hand squeezing hers while dangerous men circled their newly formed family, Celeste realized she believed him completely. And more importantly, she realized she was ready to fight alongside him to protect what they were building together. The safe house Dante chose was a penthouse apartment in downtown that offered both luxury and strategic advantage, with clear sightlines in all directions and security measures that became apparent the moment they walked through the reinforced steel door. Celeste found herself in a world she'd never imagined, surrounded by technology and precautions that drove home exactly how serious the threat against them had become. 3 days had passed since the Marconi visit, 3 days of heightened security and constant awareness that their lives had fundamentally changed. Dante had explained his position in the family organization with the same direct honesty he'd shown when discussing his dangerous business interests, painting a picture of inherited responsibility and calculated power that was both fascinating and terrifying. The Torino family had controlled legitimate businesses across the city for 3 generations. He'd told her as they packed hastily from Lucia's school and her apartment. Restaurants, construction companies, import businesses that provided employment and stability for hundreds of families who depended on their success. But maintaining that stability required dealing with other families who didn't always respect traditional boundaries, and sometimes those dealings became complicated. Complicated, she'd learned, meant territory disputes and profit margins and old grudges that could explode into violence without warning. It meant that Dante's day-to-day decisions affected not just his immediate family but an entire network of people whose livelihoods were tied to his success and his ability to navigate the dangerous waters of organized business relationships. Now, watching him coordinate security arrangements with the same efficiency he'd brought to offering her a job, Celeste was beginning to understand the full scope of what she'd chosen. This wasn't just dating a powerful man. This was accepting a place in a world where every decision had consequences and every relationship was both a potential strength and a vulnerability. "You're handling this remarkably well," Dante said, joining her at the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a spectacular view of the city spread below them. "Most people would be demanding to be taken home by now. Most people probably have a home to go back to," Celeste replied, leaning into the warmth of his presence beside her. "And most people probably haven't spent their lives dealing with circumstances they can't control." He studied her profile in the afternoon light, those green-gray eyes noting details she was only beginning to recognize as his way of constantly assessing her emotional state. There was something intensely protective about his attention, as if he was cataloging every sign of stress or fear so he could address them before they became overwhelming. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Choosing this life over the safety you had before?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond the immediate crisis. He was asking if she regretted falling for him, if the reality of his world was too much for what they'd been building together, if she was strong enough to handle what loving him would require in the long term. Looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the growing dusk, Celeste thought about her studio apartment with its leaky faucet and thin walls, her 3 jobs and constant financial stress, the lonely nights wondering if she'd ever find someone who understood what it meant to protect the people you loved regardless of the cost. Then she thought about Lucia's laughter during breakfast this morning, the way Dante looked at her like she was the answer to prayers he'd never dared voice, the sense of belonging she felt when they were together despite the dangerous circumstances. "I regret that other people want to hurt us," she said finally. "But I don't regret choosing you and Lucia. Even knowing what I know now, I'd make the same decision." Relief flooded Dante's expression, followed quickly by something that looked like wonder. He turned her to face him fully, his hands coming up to frame her face with that gentleness that never failed to surprise her given his reputation for controlled violence. "I love you," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I know it's too soon and the circumstances are impossible, but I need you to know that what I feel for you isn't just gratitude or attraction or convenience. It's love." Her heart stopped completely, then started again at double speed as the words she'd been hoping to hear washed over her with stunning force. She'd been half convinced that the intensity between them was a product of dangerous circumstances and forced proximity, that the connection she felt was stronger than what he experienced. To hear him acknowledge the same depth of feeling made everything else fade into insignificance. "I love you too," she whispered, watching his eyes darken with emotion that transformed his entire expression. "I love you and I love Lucia and I love the family we're becoming despite everything working against us." The kiss that followed was different from their first one, deeper and more urgent, filled with the desperate need to confirm their connection in the face of external threats that could tear them apart. Celeste found herself pressed against the window with Dante's body warm and solid against hers, his hands tangling in her hair while she tried to pour everything she felt into the space between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lucia's voice from across the room broke the spell with perfect timing. "Are you guys going to get married now?" she asked with the directness that only children could manage, looking up from her homework with bright curiosity. "Because Mrs. Chun says people who love each other usually get married, and I think it would be nice to have Celeste as my new mama." Celeste felt heat flood her cheeks as she met Dante's amused gaze. But there was something serious underneath his humor, a consideration of his daughter's words that suggested the idea wasn't entirely premature. "We're going to have some conversations about that, Principessa," he said gently. "But first we need to make sure everyone stays safe so we can have those conversations properly." 2 weeks later, the immediate crisis had been resolved through what Dante carefully described as negotiations that resulted in the Marconi family deciding to focus their business interests elsewhere. Celeste didn't ask for details about these negotiations, partly because she suspected she didn't want to know and partly because she was learning to trust Dante's judgment about what information she needed versus what would only cause her unnecessary worry. What mattered was that they were home, back at Bellecourt with normal routines restored and security measures that were invisible but effective. What mattered was that Lucia was sleeping peacefully in her own bed again, and that Celeste had moved into Dante's penthouse not because of external threats, but because none of them could imagine living apart anymore. The transition had been surprisingly smooth, considering how dramatically her life had changed in the space of a month. Her belongings fit easily into Dante's space, her routines meshed naturally with his and Lucia's, and the domestic intimacy of shared meals and lazy Sunday mornings felt like something they'd been building toward from that first night when she defended his daughter. It was during one of those quiet Sunday mornings that Dante brought up Lucia's upcoming 9th birthday, his expression thoughtful as he watched his daughter practice piano in the living room while Celeste curled against his side on the sofa. "She wants to have her party at the restaurant," he said quietly. "A real party with friends from school, not just family like usual. She specifically asked if you would help her plan it." The request made Celeste's heart clench with a mixture of joy and responsibility that was becoming familiar. Lucia was asking her to take on one of the most important parental duties, trusting her with something that mattered enormously to a little girl who'd had too few celebrations in her short life. "Of course I'll help her plan it," Celeste replied, already thinking about decorations and menu options that would make the day special. What does she want for a theme? Dante's smile was soft with affection as he watched his daughter's focused concentration on the piano keys. She wants a garden party theme with fairy lights and flowers everywhere. She saw something similar in a movie and decided it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever witnessed. The party planning became a bonding experience that brought all three of them closer together. Hours spent designing invitations and selecting party favors, while Lucia bounced between excitement and careful consideration of every detail. Celeste found herself falling deeper into the maternal role with each decision they made together, each moment when Lucia looked to her for approval or guidance. The night before the party, as they finished setting up the private dining room at Bellecourt with twinkling lights and elaborate floral arrangements that transformed the space into something magical, Celeste realized she'd never been happier. Watching Dante hang fairy lights under Lucia's demanding supervision while she adjusted centerpieces to meet an 80-year-old's exacting standards, she felt a completeness she'd never experienced before. This is what a family feels like, she thought, standing back to survey their handiwork while Lucia clapped her hands in delight at the transformed room. This sense of working together toward something that matters to all of you, this joy in making each other happy. The party itself was a resounding success, filled with laughter and cake, and the kind of carefree celebration that children deserved. Celeste found herself in the role of hostess and surrogate mother, helping with games and managing the chaos of 9-year-olds hopped up on sugar and excitement, while Dante handled the more practical aspects of the event. It was near the end of the party, as parents began arriving to collect their children, that Mrs. Patterson approached her with the kind of careful smile that suggested a fishing expedition for information. "You and Mr. Torino make such a lovely couple," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Lucia seems very attached to you. How long have you two been together?" The question was innocent enough on the surface, but Celeste recognized the underlying curiosity about her sudden appearance in Dante's life and her apparent integration into his family structure. She'd been fielding similar questions all afternoon from parents who were clearly trying to figure out who she was and how serious her relationship with Dante might be. "We're very happy together," Celeste replied diplomatically, neither confirming nor denying specific timelines. "Lucia is a wonderful child, and we're all enjoying getting to know each other better." It was a politician's answer that provided no real information while suggesting everything was perfectly normal and above board. But watching Mrs. Patterson's expression, Celeste realized that her relationship with Dante was now public knowledge among Lucia's social circle, which meant decisions about their future needed to be made sooner rather than later. That night, after Lucia had fallen asleep surrounded by birthday presents and exhausted by the best day she'd had in years, Dante and Celeste finally had the conversation that had been building since that first declaration of love in the safe house. "Today felt like a preview of what our life could be like," Dante said as they cleaned up the last remnants of party decorations. "You were incredible with all those children, and with their parents, and with making sure Lucia felt celebrated and special." "It felt natural," Celeste admitted, settling into his arms on the sofa with the comfortable ease that had developed between them. "Like something I was meant to do with people I was meant to do it with." Dante was quiet for a moment, his hands stroking through her hair with absent affection while he seemed to wrestle with something important. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a seriousness that made her look up to meet his eyes. "Celeste, I want to ask you something, and I need you to know there's no pressure for any particular answer. But I also need you to understand how serious I am about what we're building together." Her pulse quickened with anticipation and nervousness, sensing that they were approaching another crossroads that would define the future of their relationship. "Marry me," he said simply, his green-gray eyes holding hers with complete honesty. "Not because of the circumstances or the danger or because it would make things easier. Marry me because you love me and because you want to build a life with Lucia and me, because you want to be her mother officially and because I want to be your husband officially." The proposal was everything she could have hoped for and nothing like what she'd imagined. There was no ring, no dramatic gesture, no carefully planned romantic setting. Instead, there was complete honesty and the weight of real love and the promise of a family that had already begun forming around them. "Yes," she heard herself say, the word carrying all the hope and determination and love she'd been building since that first night when she'd chosen to protect his daughter. Yes to all of it. To marrying you and to being Lucia's mother and to whatever challenges we'll face together. The kiss that followed was interrupted by small feet padding across the hardwood floor, and they broke apart to find Lucia standing in the doorway in her pajamas, rubbing sleepy eyes with obvious curiosity. "What are you talking about?" she asked with the directness that never failed to catch them off guard. Dante and Celeste exchanged a look, and he nodded slightly, giving her permission to be the one to share their news. "Your papa just asked me to marry him," Celeste said gently, watching Lucia's expression transform from sleepy confusion to wide-awake excitement. "Which means, if it's okay with you, I would officially become your mama." Lucia's squeal of delight probably woke half the building, but neither Dante nor Celeste cared as she launched herself into their arms with the kind of pure joy that made everything they'd gone through worthwhile. As they held each other on the sofa, officially engaged and officially a family regardless of what paperwork and ceremonies lay ahead, Celeste realized that the scared waitress who defended a little girl a month ago had ceased to exist entirely. In her place was a woman who'd chosen love over safety, who'd embraced a dangerous man's world because it came with a daughter who needed a mother and a future that was worth any risk. Looking at Dante's expression as he held both his girls close, seeing the wonder and gratitude and fierce protectiveness in his eyes, she knew she'd made the right choice at every crucial moment. The phone rang just after midnight, shattering the peaceful aftermath of their engagement celebration. Dante answered with the immediate alertness that came from years of handling crisis calls, his expression shifting to dangerous focus as he listened to whoever was on the other end. "The restaurant," he said grimly, ending the call and already reaching for clothes. "There's been an incident. Everyone's safe, but there's damage and a message that was clearly meant for me." Within 20 minutes they were standing in front of Bellecourt, staring at shattered windows and graffiti that made the Marconi family's displeasure unmistakably clear. The beautiful dining room where they'd celebrated Lucia's birthday 12 hours earlier was destroyed, fairy lights torn down and tables overturned in a display of malicious destruction that was meant to send a specific message about the consequences of crossing certain lines. "This is about more than business territory," Dante said quietly, his voice carrying a cold fury that made Celeste understand exactly why people found him dangerous. "This is personal now, which means the rules have changed completely." Looking at the destruction of the place where they'd fallen in love, where they'd built their family, where they'd planned to build their future, Celeste felt her own anger rise to match his. Someone had violated their sanctuary, threatened their happiness, demonstrated that nowhere was safe as long as these people decided they were enemies. "What do we do?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "We finish this," Dante replied, those green-gray eyes holding promises of retribution that probably should have frightened her but instead made her feel fiercely proud of the man she'd chosen to love. "We finish this so that our daughter can grow up without looking over her shoulder, so we can have the life we're building without constantly waiting for the next attack." Standing in front of the wreckage of their restaurant, holding hands while surrounded by evidence of enemies who wanted to destroy everything they cared about, Celeste realized she was ready for whatever came next. She'd chosen this life, chosen this man, chosen this fight, and she intended to win it. The second safe house was even more secure than the first, buried deep in a residential neighborhood that looked completely ordinary from the outside, while hiding sophisticated security systems and strategic advantages that became apparent only when you understood what to look for. Celeste had been living there for 5 days with Lucia and a rotating team of guards, watching her new daughter adapt to confinement with the resilience that children possessed, while fighting her own growing frustration with enforced helplessness. She understood the necessity. The attack on Bellecourt had been followed by incidents at 2 other Torino properties, each escalation designed to draw Dante into increasingly desperate responses. His enemies were playing a calculated game of psychological warfare, trying to force him into mistakes by threatening everything he cared about while limiting his options for retaliation. But understanding the strategy didn't make the reality any easier to bear. Celeste had gone from managing a busy restaurant and building a life with the man she loved to sitting in a beautiful prison, watching Lucia try to maintain normal routines while armed strangers monitored their every movement. The weight of being protected rather than contributing to solutions was wearing on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Lucia was handling the situation better than either of the adults, perhaps because her young life had already included enough upheaval that she'd developed coping mechanisms for circumstances beyond her control. She maintained her school work through online tutoring, practiced piano on the electronic keyboard Dante had arranged to be delivered, and seemed to accept their temporary living arrangements with the kind of practical resignation that broke Celeste's heart. It was during their 6th day in confinement that Marco, Dante's second-in-command, arrived with intelligence that changed everything. Celeste had met him briefly during the initial crisis, noting the way he balanced loyalty to Dante with genuine concern for Lucia's well-being. But this was the first time she'd seen him look genuinely worried. "We intercepted communications between Marconi operatives," he told Dante, his voice low enough that Lucia couldn't overhear from where she was coloring at the kitchen table. "They're planning to grab the girl during her online tutoring session tomorrow. Someone gave them information about the security schedules and the layout of this location." Celeste felt ice flood her veins as the implications sank in. These people weren't just targeting Dante's businesses anymore. They were coming for Lucia specifically, planning to use a 9-year-old child as leverage in their war against her father. The casual cruelty of it made her stomach clench with rage and fear. "How?" Dante's voice carried the kind of controlled fury that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. "How did they get that information? We're still investigating, but the breach came from inside. Someone with access to our security protocols fed them everything they needed to plan a successful operation." The betrayal hit Dante like a physical blow, and Celeste watched him process the reality that someone in his inner circle had sold out his daughter's safety. For a man who'd built his entire life on loyalty and trust, the violation went beyond professional disappointment into something deeply personal. Celeste found herself speaking before she'd consciously decided to intervene. "What if we used their plan against them? What if instead of running again we turned tomorrow into a trap?" Both men turned to stare at her with expressions that suggested they'd forgotten she was in the room. She was accustomed to being treated as someone who needed protection rather than someone who could contribute to strategy. But looking at their surprised faces, she realized she'd been underestimating her own value in this situation. "Explain," Dante said simply, his tone suggesting he was willing to hear her out despite his obvious concern about involving her more directly in dangerous planning. "They're expecting to find Lucia in a specific location at a specific time, following a routine they think they understand," Celeste said, her mind racing through possibilities as she spoke. "But what if Lucia isn't there? What if instead of the vulnerable target they're expecting, they find a trap that gives us the advantage for once?" Marco was already following her reasoning, his expression shifting from surprise to consideration. "We could set up a decoy operation," he said slowly. "Make it look like normal tutoring session protocols while actually controlling every variable." "Exactly," Celeste continued, feeling more confident as the plan took shape. "And while they're focused on the fake target, we can position ourselves to identify who they are, how many of them there are, and ideally capture someone who can tell us about the larger operation." Dante was quiet for a long moment, those green-gray eyes studying her face with the intensity she'd come to associate with him making important decisions. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of admiration and concern that made her understand he was torn between respecting her intelligence and wanting to keep her as far from danger as possible. "You're talking about using yourself as bait," he said quietly, "putting yourself directly in harm's way to protect Lucia and to give us tactical advantage." "I'm talking about being part of the solution instead of just another person you have to protect," Celeste replied firmly. "These people have disrupted our lives, destroyed our restaurant, and now they're threatening our daughter. I'm not willing to hide while other people fight battles that should be ours to fight." The word daughter hung in the air between them, carrying weight that went beyond legal definitions or formal adoption papers. Lucia was theirs, belonged to them both in ways that made her safety a shared responsibility, and Celeste was claiming her right to defend what they'd built together. "It's dangerous," Marco warned, though his tone suggested he was already calculating logistics rather than trying to dissuade her. "If something goes wrong, If they deviate from the expected plan, you could be seriously hurt or worse. Everything about loving this family is dangerous, Celeste said simply, glancing toward where Lucia was carefully coloring within the lines of her artwork, blissfully unaware of the adult conversation happening 10 feet away. But some risks are worth taking, and some fights are worth having. That night, as they refined the operational details and coordinated with security teams, Celeste felt a transformation happening within herself. The woman who'd been content to serve tables and worry about rent payments was evolving into someone willing to face armed criminals to protect her family. The change should have been frightening, but instead it felt like finally becoming who she was meant to be. The plan was elegantly simple in its basic structure while complex in its execution details. Celeste would maintain normal tutoring session routines in the main living area, while Lucia remained hidden in the secure room with Marco and additional security. When the Marconi operatives entered the house expecting to find an easy target, they'd encounter a situation designed to capture rather than kill, providing intelligence while eliminating the immediate threat. Dante would coordinate from outside with backup teams, ready to respond if the situation escalated beyond what they could handle internally. The entire operation balanced the need for actionable intelligence against the reality that Celeste would be exposed to genuine danger for several crucial minutes before help could reach her. The morning of the operation, Celeste found herself calmer than she'd expected. She helped Lucia with breakfast, reviewed schoolwork, and maintained all the normal routines while armed security moved into position throughout the house. There was something surreal about preparing for violence while discussing math homework, but she found strength in the contradiction. "You don't have to do this," Dante said quietly as final preparations were being completed. "We can find another way, try a different approach that doesn't put you at risk." Looking into his eyes, seeing the love and fear and respect warring in his expression, Celeste felt absolute certainty about her choice. This was her family, her fight, her responsibility. And this was her chance to prove that she belonged in his world, not just as someone to be protected, but as a true partner in facing whatever challenges their life together would bring. "Yes, I do have to do this," she said softly, touching his face with gentle fingers that couldn't quite hide their trembling. "Because this is what loving you means. This is what being Lucia's mother means. And this is what I need to do to become the person this family needs me to be." The kiss they shared was fierce and desperate, tasting of fear and love and determination. When they broke apart, Celeste saw acceptance in Dante's eyes, acknowledgement that she was strong enough for what lay ahead and brave enough to face it willingly. The Marconi operatives arrived at exactly the predicted time, moving with the kind of professional efficiency that made it clear they'd planned this operation carefully and believed they held every advantage. Celeste watched through hidden cameras as 3 men approached the house, their body language confident and their weapons already drawn. They entered through the back entrance they'd clearly been told about, moving directly toward the living room where tutoring sessions normally took place. Celeste sat at the laptop, back to the entrance, maintaining the appearance of normal activity while every muscle in her body coiled with tension. She heard their footsteps, felt rather than saw their presence entering her space, and forced herself to remain still until the moment came to act. When the first man spoke, his voice carrying casual confidence that they'd successfully cornered their target, she spun around with the taser Marco had given her and activated the signal that would bring reinforcements flooding into the house. The next few minutes passed in a blur of controlled chaos, shouts and struggles, and the efficient sound of well-trained security teams neutralizing threats with minimal violence. When the noise finally stopped, 3 Marconi operatives were in custody, their weapons confiscated and their communication devices providing exactly the intelligence Dante's people needed to plan their final response. Celeste found herself shaking in the aftermath, adrenaline flooding her system with delayed reaction to the danger she'd faced. But underneath the physical response was a profound sense of satisfaction, the knowledge that she'd contributed meaningfully to protecting her family rather than simply accepting protection from others. When Dante arrived 10 minutes later, moving through the house with predatory urgency to confirm that she and Lucia were safe, the expression on his face when he saw her sitting calmly at the kitchen table made everything worthwhile. There was pride there and relief, and something that looked like awe at what she'd been willing to risk for their family. The information they extracted from their prisoners led directly to the final confrontation with Marconi leadership, a meeting that took place 2 days later in a warehouse district that provided privacy for the kind of conversation that would end their conflict permanently. Celeste insisted on being present, not as a participant but as a witness to how these matters were resolved in Dante's world. She watched from a safe distance as he negotiated the terms of the Marconi family's complete withdrawal from any business that touched Torino interests. There was no shouting, no dramatic threats, just calm discussion of consequences and realistic assessment of power dynamics. When negotiation failed to produce satisfactory terms, the conversation shifted to demonstration of exactly why continued conflict would be inadvisable. The violence, when it came, was swift and efficient, more surgical than brutal. Dante's response to direct threats against his family was absolute and final, leaving no room for misunderstanding about the consequences of targeting people under his protection. Celeste found herself watching without flinching, understanding that this was the reality of the world she'd chosen, the price of security for those she loved. When it was over, when the immediate threat had been eliminated and the surviving Marconi leadership had agreed to permanent ceasefire terms that would keep Lucia safe for the rest of her childhood, Celeste felt something settle in her chest that she recognized as complete acceptance. She'd witnessed Dante at his most dangerous, seen him make life-and-death decisions with the same calm efficiency he brought to restaurant management. She'd watched him demonstrate exactly why people spoke his name in respectful whispers, why crossing his family brought consequences that most people weren't prepared to face. And she discovered that instead of being frightened or repulsed by this reality, she was proud of him for protecting what mattered and grateful that his power served their family's safety. That night, as they finally returned to their real home with Lucia sleeping peacefully in her own bed for the first time in 2 weeks, Celeste and Dante sat together on their terrace overlooking the city lights and discussed the future with complete honesty about what it would require. "You've seen everything now," Dante said quietly, his arm tight around her shoulders as if he was still processing the reality that she'd chosen to stay through the worst of it. "You know exactly who I am and what loving me means in practical terms. Are you sure this is the life you want?" Looking out at the city that was partly his domain, thinking about the daughter sleeping safely down the hall and the man beside her who would move heaven and earth to keep them both protected, Celeste felt absolute certainty about her answer. "This is exactly the life I want," she said firmly. "With exactly the man I want, protecting exactly the family I want. I'm not interested in a different version of you or a safer version of this life. I want all of it, including the parts that other people would find frightening." The relief in Dante's expression was profound, as if he'd been holding his breath for weeks, waiting to discover whether she would ultimately choose safety over love. When he kissed her, there was gratitude and passion and promise in the connection between them, acknowledgement that they'd survived their first real test as a family and emerged stronger than before. Tomorrow they would start rebuilding Bellecourt, restoring the restaurant where they'd fallen in love into something even more beautiful than before. They would plan their wedding, officially make Celeste Lucia's mother, and begin the next phase of their life together with the security that came from knowing their enemies had learned to leave them alone. But tonight, they simply held each other on their terrace and marveled at what they'd built together from the ashes of their separate broken lives. Family, a future, a love strong enough to face any threat and emerge victorious. 6 weeks later, Bellecourt reopened with security measures that were invisible to customers but comprehensive enough to ensure that what had happened before could never happen again. The reconstruction had been an opportunity to make improvements, updating the kitchen equipment and expanding the private dining spaces while maintaining the elegant atmosphere that had made the restaurant a city landmark. Celeste stood in the dining room on the morning of their soft opening, watching the staff prepare for the lunch service with a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation. She'd been promoted from manager to partner in the business, her name now appearing alongside Dante's on all the official paperwork, a formal recognition of what had already become true in practice. The past month and a half had been a whirlwind of reconstruction, wedding planning, and integrating her brother Marcus into their expanded family structure. Dante had insisted on paying for Marcus to finish his degree without the financial stress that had been weighing on both siblings, and had offered him a summer internship with the legitimate business operations that would provide valuable experience for his economics major. Marcus had been suspicious at first, clearly aware that his sister's new life came with complications he didn't fully understand. But watching Dante with Lucia, seeing the genuine care and protection he provided for the people he loved, her brother had gradually relaxed into accepting the opportunities being offered without constantly questioning the motivations behind them. The wedding planning had been surprisingly simple once they decided on an intimate ceremony that focused on family rather than social expectations. Lucia had appointed herself chief wedding coordinator, with strong opinions about flowers and music and the color of Celeste's dress. Watching her stepdaughter Taube throw herself into planning with infectious enthusiasm had made Celeste realize how much this little girl needed something to celebrate, something joyful to balance the disruption and fear of recent weeks. "You're nervous?" Dante observed, joining her at the hostess station where she'd been reviewing the evening's reservation list for the third time in 10 minutes. "A little," she admitted, leaning into his solid warmth with the comfort that had become second nature. "It feels important to get this right, to prove that we can come back from what happened and be even better than before." "We're already better than before," he said quietly, his arm tightening around her waist with possessive affection. "Better because you're here, because Lucia has a mother again, because I finally understand what it means to have a true partner in all of this." The simple declaration made her heart flutter the way it always did when he reminded her how much their relationship had transformed his life as well as hers. There were moments when she still couldn't quite believe that the powerful man who commanded respect throughout the city looked at her like she was his most precious possession. But the evidence was undeniable in every gesture and decision he made. The lunch service went perfectly, with regular customers returning to express their relief that their favorite restaurant was back in operation and new customers drawn by curiosity about the renovations. Celeste moved between tables with the confidence that came from months of experience, but now she was greeting guests as an owner rather than an employee, representing the establishment rather than simply serving it. It was during the afternoon lull between lunch and dinner that Dante asked her to join him in his office for a conversation that had been building since they decided to rebuild rather than relocate. She found him standing behind his desk with an expression that suggested he was nervous about something, an unusual state for a man who typically approached everything with calm confidence. "Celeste," he began, then stopped, running a hand through his hair with uncharacteristic uncertainty. "I had a speech planned for this, but looking at you now, in our restaurant, knowing everything we've built together, it seems unnecessary to make this complicated." Before she could ask what he was talking about, he moved around the desk and took her hands in his, those green-gray eyes holding hers with the complete attention that never failed to make her feel like the most important person in his world. "You've already proven yourself as Lucia's mother, as my partner, as someone strong enough to handle anything our life together might bring. You've stood with me through the worst crisis we're likely to face and emerged not just intact but integral to our success. You've made our family complete in ways I didn't even realize we needed." He paused, searching her expression as if looking for permission to continue, and she realized with sudden breathless anticipation where this conversation was leading. "I know I already proposed and you already said yes, but that was during crisis circumstances with external threats affecting our judgment. Now, in peacetime, with clear heads and full knowledge of what we're choosing, I want to ask you again properly." He dropped to one knee right there in his office, pulling out a ring box that made her gasp with surprise and delight. The diamond was beautiful but not ostentatious, set in platinum with a classic elegance that perfectly matched her personal style. "Celeste Romano, will you marry me? Will you officially become Lucia's mother and my wife and my partner in everything we build from this day forward?" The proposal was everything she could have wanted and nothing like what she'd expected. There was no elaborate setup, no audience, no public display. Instead, there was complete sincerity and the weight of real love and the promise of a future they'd already begun building together. "Yes," she said, laughing through tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Yes to all of it, again and always and forever, yes." The ring fit perfectly, sparkling in the afternoon light streaming through the office windows as Dante stood and pulled her into his arms for a kiss that tasted like promises and possibilities, and the kind of happiness she'd never imagined having access to. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the private garden behind Dante's penthouse, with only immediate family and closest friends in attendance. Celeste wore a simple ivory dress that Lucia had helped select, and carried a bouquet of white roses mixed with the baby's breath that her soon-to-be daughter had insisted would make everything perfect. Marcus walked her down the aisle, his young face serious with the responsibility of representing their parents at this crucial moment. Watching her brother's expression as he placed her hand in Dante's, seeing approval and relief and genuine happiness there, Celeste felt the last of her concerns about the choices she'd made fade into insignificance. The ceremony was brief and meaningful. Vows they'd written themselves that acknowledged the unusual circumstances of their courtship while focusing on the commitment they were making to face whatever came next as a united family. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Lucia cheered with unrestrained joy that made everyone laugh and reminded them all what this celebration was really about. The reception was held in the main dining room at Bellecourt, with food prepared by their chef and atmosphere that perfectly captured the intimate elegance they'd wanted. Celeste danced with her new husband while Lucia and Marcus argued good-naturedly about wedding cake protocol, and the security team maintained discreet watch from positions that allowed them to enjoy the festivities while ensuring everyone's safety. That night, as Mr. and Mrs. Torino, they tucked their daughter into bed and marveled at how natural it felt to be officially what they'd already become in practice. Lucia insisted on calling Celeste Mama for the first time, the word carrying weight that brought tears to everyone's eyes and officially sealed the transformation that had been building since that first night in the restaurant. 6 months later, Celeste stood in the same dining room where Franco had once humiliated a little girl, watching a similar scene unfold with very different results. A new server, young and clearly struggling financially, had accidentally spilled water on a customer who was berating him with increasing volume and cruelty. The boy couldn't have been more than 19, and the fear in his eyes reminded her painfully of herself at that age. Without hesitation, she approached the table with the calm authority that came from owning the establishment and having learned to navigate difficult personalities with grace. She apologized to the customer for the inconvenience, arranged for his meal to be complimentary, and quietly reassured the server that accidents happened and his job was secure. The incident was resolved within minutes, but she was aware of Dante watching from his usual corner table, Lucia coloring beside him while he conducted business calls. There was pride in his expression as he observed her handling the situation, acknowledgement that she'd grown into her role as restaurant owner and family matriarch with the same grace she'd shown in accepting the challenges of his dangerous world. Later that evening, as they walked home through streets that felt safe because of the respect Dante commanded and the peace he'd negotiated with former enemies, Celeste reflected on the distance she'd traveled from that desperate waitress who'd risked everything to protect a stranger's child. She was 5 months pregnant now, the gentle curve of her belly visible beneath the elegant dresses that had replaced her server's uniform. The pregnancy had been a surprise that became a blessing, adding another layer to their happiness and giving Lucia the little brother or sister she'd been wishing for since the wedding. Marcus was thriving in his internship and would graduate next spring with job prospects that included several positions within the legitimate Torino business enterprises. He'd grown close to Lucia, taking his role as protective older brother seriously, while maintaining the easy affection that made family gatherings feel warm and natural. The restaurant was more successful than ever, with reservations booked months in advance and a reputation that extended far beyond their original clientele. Celeste had proven herself as both a business partner and a strategic thinker, contributing to expansion plans that would bring their vision to new locations while maintaining the intimate atmosphere that made Bellecourt special. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most. Mornings when she woke up in Dante's arms with Lucia crawling into bed between them. Evenings when they cooked dinner together while discussing Lucia's school projects and planning weekend activities. Conversations over wine after their daughter had gone to bed, sharing dreams and concerns, and the comfortable intimacy of people who'd chosen to build something permanent together. Standing on their terrace that night, looking out at the city lights while Dante's hand rested protectively over her growing belly, Celeste thought about the question she'd posed to her audience that first night. Have you ever stood up for someone when you knew it could cost you everything? The answer, she'd discovered, was that sometimes what you thought would cost you everything actually gave you everything instead. Sometimes defending someone vulnerable led to finding your own strength. Sometimes choosing courage over safety led to finding love that made every risk worthwhile. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, Standing up for a little girl in a restaurant led to becoming that child's mother, marrying the man who'd been waiting his whole life for someone strong enough to be his partner, and building a family that was worth fighting for with everything you had. Looking up at Dante's profile in the soft light, feeling their baby move beneath his gentle touch while Lucia slept safely in her room, Celeste knew she'd found exactly what she'd been searching for without knowing she was searching at all. Home. Family. Love that was strong enough to face any challenge and deep enough to last a lifetime. So let me ask you one more question as we end this story together. When life presents you with the chance to choose love over safety, courage over comfort, will you be brave enough to take it? Because sometimes the most unexpected moments change everything, and the most unlikely people become the answer to prayers you didn't know you were praying. Thank you for sharing this journey with us tonight, and remember that love stories happen when we're brave enough to write them.